Well, I immediately abandoned the boring title that Zoltan assigned to me to tell you what I really think. Um, I'm going to show you all the data you just saw again, and that gives me an excuse to go really fast because I know you're all waiting for lunch. So just context. Of course, the EU and many other countries are counting on a major land carbon sink, including technological solutions by 2050, a significant amount of carbon removal technology. So I blew up that bit at the end so you could see what that looks like. And that's mostly BECCS, at least that's what they think. You saw this already, but this is sort of a different take on it. This is energy input. So this isn't final energy out the smokestack in terms of megawatts, but this is energy input. And it's solid biofuels, which is a lot of different things. And then wood, which is the dotted line. And then forest biomass estimated by the JRC to be about 50% of all woody biomass is directly from the forest. So primary woody biomass as opposed to secondary. I think it's higher than that now. And, oops, didn't need to go there yet. And as you can see, wind there is in green, solar, blah, 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 all quite small compared to bioenergy inputs. Incentives have caused a major increase in wood burning. So this is this is data on what's actually being burned. And take home message here, small percentage from non-wood feedstocks, black liquor, which is a byproduct of the pulp and paper industry, is kind of holding steady through time. And wood is more than 90% of the total now. And the pellet share, which I pulled out in red there. Now this is green tons equivalent. So this isn't tons of pellets. This is the tons of green wood it would take to make those pellets. So you can see that that's really increased a lot. And pellets are still a minority, but it's growing. And then here it is by sector. So this is the data that Gabriel showed you, but all on one slide, basically. So energy sector use is really important. That's the purple, but the electricity only is still a small share, but extremely inefficient. So very little useful energy for a lot of wood input. Industrial use, pretty much holding steady through time, as you can see. The largest share there, which I'm showing as residential heating and then other self-heating. So this isn't combined heat and power pumping heat to your house. This is people burning wood in their homes. Wood or maybe garbage, right? That's really grown a lot. So the wood industry loves to claim that they're only burning residues, but we did an investigation with using these are some photographs that were collected by allies of ours in a report that we put out, and then some from various other places. I actually took that picture in British Columbia. That's a picture of the Enviva plant in the United States. The logging trucks going into the pellet plant there. This is one of the pellet plants in British Columbia, and then these are probably plants that are just chipping wood and burning it directly, not pelletizing it first. The Estonia picture, I'm not sure if that may be a pellet plant, but those are definitely tree trunks. That's not what we would think of as residues. And when you think of residues as tops and branches that are left over after logging. So the biomass industry can really use, especially since they're mostly still burning chips, remember, not pellets. So for pellets, they really do want clean wood. So they want clean industrial residues or logs that they can debark and then turn into pellets. But most of the wood burned in the EU is still burned as either chips or firewood. And if it's chips, they can throw anything into a chipper. And the pellet industry burns a lot of biomass on site to dry the pellets. So because they can vacuum up everything, basically you get an incentive to remove everything out of the forest including low-value wood, so-called low-value wood. And the wood pellet industry obviously wants the biggest, cleanest tree trunks they can find in the lowest supervision venues that they can find, which happens to be one of those places is British Columbia. So the BBC did a really interesting documentary. I have the link for it. I've put it here. I assume these slides will be shown, so you can copy that link and watch. It's 29-minute documentary by the BBC showing Drax pellet operations, just basically doing this kind of clear cutting, turning that into pellets, and then lying about it right to your face, saying, no, we don't use trees. This was an expose done by the New York Times, and it was a lot of really wonderful work that was done by the Environmental Investigation Agency, and our dear colleague of ours, Luke Chamberlain, helped coordinate a lot of this work, and I think there were people in this room who helped on this as well. Basically showing that the wood pellet industry this is Romania. Wood pellet industry is, making a lot of wood pellets for heating. So these are not necessarily burned in power plants. This might be pellets that are put into a plastic bag and sold for domestic heating. And part of that was some satellite imagery. So this is very typical. There's a lot of evidence from satellite imagery and then people on the ground following the logging trucks back to the pellet plant. So they know that these tree trunks are being turned into pellets. So here's the, the chart you've already seen 2 or 3 times. Now what I'm showing here is the whole land sink in purple with the 2030 target for the EU as a whole, negative 310 million tons of CO2 uptake. The green is the remaining forest land. So that's a category in UNFCCC accounting. And then the red is just woody biomass, so not all biomass. And this is based on EU consumption numbers translated into green tons. So it's not the memo item data that Gabrielle showed. It's the EU data on consumption. And then the harvested wood products in orange. So basically this collapse in the sink that we're showing is clearly not being driven by additional harvesting for wood products. It's not, that the pulp and paper industry suddenly decided to double overnight. No, it is clearly wood for energy that is driving, to the extent that logging drives the collapse of the sink. Wood for energy is the primary driver. So breaking that out by country, so some of this is data on indigenous production of solid biomass for Estonia and Latvia, which, albeit small, turn out to be 2 very important countries for exporting pellets to the UK to be burned at Drax. So you can see the yellow there is the increase in wood use for wood pellet production. And then the other kinds of biomass that's being consumed. So this is Estonia's consumption, but it's not all self-consumption because they're consuming in order to export. So this is total consumption, including exports plus self-use. And then land sector carbon flux, as reported a couple of years ago for Estonia and Latvia. So you can see this abrupt total collapse of the land and forest carbon sink in Estonia, which is the forest is no longer acting as a net sink for CO2, but is now a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. And finally, my favorite, probably yours too, I'm sure, Finland, which loves to tell everyone how, important they are in terms of running forest policy in the EU. Turns out they are extremely influential. And this is consumption data, not production data, but this is what they're consuming for biomass on the top, broken out by sector as before. And then again, land sector carbon flux with a collapse of the sink. And that dot is actually the 2030 target. And I plotted it for this graph on the 2020 line, but you should imagine that out in 2030. So clearly, Finland has a lot of work to do if they want to get down to that land sink again. And then our colleague Varpu, who's been going around and taking pictures of wood use at bioenergy, at pellet and bioenergy plants in Finland. So this is what they're burning. And the official statistics from Finland, the government researchers, are saying it is roundwood logging for energy that has largely driven the collapse of the sink in Finland. So this is the crux issue, I think, for why this has been going on and why it continues to be perpetuated by policymakers, is that everyone loves to talk about sustainable biomass. And they equate sustainable biomass with carbon neutral biomass. Now, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, biomass is not actually zero carbon. It's just counted as zero in the energy sector under IPCC protocols because it is actually counted in the land sector when you do national level reporting. And that's fine if you're reporting national level statistics. But if you're just looking at the energy sector, it does not mean you should be counting bioenergy as zero. It's just an accounting convention. So they have retroactively justified the treatment of bioenergy as zero carbon by saying that as long as biomass is harvested sustainably, that it has zero emissions. And what that means in its most basic definition is that you are harvesting at a level that is less than growth. And most simply put, it is the sum of harvesting and growth. I mean, it's totally oversimplifying it, but for this example, that results in the net flux of CO2. So in this isn't through time. These are just different examples. So if you're growing 5 units and you're harvesting 1, your net flux is -4 because your growth was -5 and you've harvested 1 and burned 1. So now your net flux is -4. And so likewise for all those examples. Now all of those, because harvesting is exceeding, because growth is exceeding harvesting in terms of the total magnitude or equivalent to it, where they're -5 and 5 in the last example or the next to last example, those would all be treated as equivalently sustainable under EU thinking, and therefore having zero impact on the atmosphere. But obviously this isn't true because you've got a sink of -4 and a sink of 0, and those are really different because to the atmosphere, if you diminish a sink, it's the same thing as increasing an emission. So only that last example that I ringed in red would, under this bogus theory of sustainability, only if you actually do exceed growth with harvesting would that be considered unsustainable. And all of a sudden, you're supposed to start counting the carbon. But only then. And everything up to that point is treated as zero. And this is completely ridiculous. And anyone who works on land carbon relations in even the most minor way gets this. And yet there's probably not a single EU official who would actually get this and admit to this. I mean, anyone who's actually in charge of making policy. All the European Commission scientists certainly understand this. But this is baked into whenever you hear about sustainable biomass being zero carbon and carbon neutral and helping toward climate targets, this is what they're talking about. The ironic thing is, let me just tell you, before I tell you about the ironic thing. So here, scientists and IPCC basically admit that the idea of sustainability is not a meaningful idea. The ironic thing is that their own rules don't actually ensure even sustainable harvesting. So the Europeans, the EU Renewable Energy Directive, which I worked on the last few years with Carl and Zoltan and others in this room, was a reform of the law of the rules governing what counts as qualifying biomass in the Renewable Energy Directive. And their own rules do not ensure this condition of growth exceeding harvesting is actually met. Now, the reason I'm showing you this slide is because the outcome of all these rules, the RED 2, the RED 3, lots of other forest stuff happening around the EU, has been so bad, and it got so discouraging working on policy that I just decided, like being an American, we sue everybody, right? So we co-founded with a UK group, the Lifescape Project, something called the Forest Litigation Collaborative. So we're engaged in litigation right now. For instance, we're helping on a case against the EU taxonomy, which treats bioenergy and forestry as climate mitigation. So we have a court hearing on that in Luxembourg in mid-November, which we're pretty excited about. We've got a case against the UK. Anyway, back to the RED 3. Conscious that we're short on time and there's a lot of words on this slide, I encourage you to just concentrate on the yellow highlighted bits. The sustainability criteria of the RED do not address climate impacts of bioenergy. Now, there's some good new provisions in there that on paper do appear to help protect some systems like primary forests and old growth, although it leaves a tremendous amount of discretion to the member states in terms of how they define old growth, how they define industrial grade roundwood, etc. Basically, there is one small provision, a new provision in the RED that looks encouraging, where biomass production is supposed to be compatible with the land sector targets for each member state. We have no idea how each member state will interpret that clause and whether it will have any kind of teeth to it at all. And that's one of the things that we're very, very interested in exploring in a litigation capacity. So come talk to me if you want to talk more about that. Anyway, the next carbon con, of course, is BECCS with sustainable biomass. So we know that sustainable biomass isn't carbon neutral. So if you're going to claim that you're going to deliver negative emissions with bioenergy, it actually does need to be carbon neutral. So BECCS is a carbon con because if you're starting with biomass that isn't carbon neutral, you're not going to get negative emissions by doing BECCS. It's just basic. So basically, policymakers need to really see the light on this, because there's nothing about taking trees, which already represent carbon that was pulled from the atmosphere decades or centuries ago, burning them, storing that CO2 below ground, that is going to deliver negative emissions. You're just putting previously sequestered carbon in a different non-atmospheric pool. It's the same thing with coal. You can do that with coal, CO2. It's the same thing. Likewise, in general, you need to back off on the bioeconomy, which is just this idea that we're going to replace everything carbon intensive with more wood. You don't get to do both. You can either store more carbon in forests, or you can lose a bunch of that carbon and store a fraction of the carbon that you took out of the forest in some other pool, like harvested wood products or below ground storage with CCS. But basically, you don't get to do both. So these are the websites that we run, and you can link to some of the work. But before I left, I just wanted to show you one more thing, because Gabrielle's numbers on the BECCS and the projected growth in BECCS are so alarming, and I just wanted to share with you. So as part of our suit against the UK government, we had access, because of document discovery, which is one of the fun things about filing litigation, is that you get to request documents. And one of the things that we requested was their modeling for how they're projecting a huge increase in biomass use and BECCS as a means of achieving net zero in the UK. So we got this model, And I knew from reading the biomass strategy that there was a lot of non-wood biomass in there projected. But I just wanted to share with you, we finally published our analysis because they made the model public, so we were able to make our analysis public. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of graphs. So they had a restricted scenario and an ambitious scenario for this is domestic. They're going to grow a bunch of biomass, crop biomass, and coppicing wood and that kind of thing in the UK, but they're going to import far more from overseas. And they've got a restricted scenario, which assumes that the UK only gets a small fraction of what's out there in the world, and then the quote unquote ambitious scenario. Now they admitted, which just projects a lot more, obviously, like the UK gets everything. No, not really, but it's not everything. It's still, they think, reasonable. They admitted that their overall arching climate model, which is the UK Times model, which feeds all this stuff in and then spits out a number like, are you going to achieve net zero or not? They admitted that unless they incorporated the ambitious scenario into their modeling, they would not be able to achieve net zero in 2050. So this is total, what is this? This is total solid biomass available to the UK in the two scenarios. So the numbers for 2020 are the same in both scenarios. And then you look at this massive, massive increase. Now this is in petajoules. So a petajoule is about the equivalent of about 91,000 tons of green wood. So multiply each of those numbers by, you could round it up to 100,000 tons because this is crops, not wood, and crops are far less energy dense. So you need more stuff to get the same amount of energy out of it. So multiply all those numbers by 100 and that'll tell you what the tonnage is that they're talking about importing. Now, I want to point out that this isn't, there's so many crazy assumptions in here. But this is, obviously massive, massive upscaling. And then other just crazy assumptions. This is available. If anyone's interested, I can give you the link for this. And first of all, nobody actually burns crop residues and agricultural crops. Like, they're really hard to burn because they're dirty, they're hard to process, they're wet. So this is their assumption about, what is this? This is land. This is total bioenergy from perennial energy crops. So the other incredible assumption, one other incredible assumption they made was that there's going to be this huge, huge increase in energy cropping around the world. And there's going to be zero land use change associated with that. So no direct land use change and no indirect land use change. So that allowed them to treat all the biomass as having zero emissions in the model, which was a necessary precondition for them to be able to get it to deliver so-called negative emissions. So again, just graph after graph. This is energy from energy crops in the two scenarios. I want to point out that the blue, other South Asia and Oceania, that includes North Korea and Afghanistan. Okay, so welcome to your new energy future that we're going to be importing energy crops from North Korea. Good luck with that. Anyway, the whole thing is insane. It's insane. Huge amounts of wood and wood residues from Brazil, which was, to their credit, they did identify as a country that has a huge land use change problem and a net loss of forests because of it. And yet they're saying, well, don't worry about that. We're just going to get so much wood from Brazil. Anyway, I'll wrap up here, but I just wanted to point out that it's not, the BECCS assumptions are underpinned not just by assumptions about upscaling woody biomass use, but also by massive energy crop use. And this is just the UK, by the way. So this isn't the EU. This is like, peaky little UK, So anyway, that's it.
Thank you.